So I'm out of the loop. I only recently played through Star Wars Jedi Survivor after the game has been out for 2 years already at the time of this recording. And it's a game that I've been excited to play through ever since I saw the teaser trailer for it and trying to figure out what happens next after Jedi Fallen Order, the game before it. And having played through Jedi Survivor, I have some differing emotions about it. Generally speaking, I thought it was an enjoyable game, but I also can't help but feel a sense of disappointment walking away from that game as well. So I wanted to take some time to dig into that a little bit without spoiling anything. And the biggest thing starting off is the story. I think that when you look at just the general contribution that Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor bring to the Star Wars brand, I think honestly it's immense. There may be only a couple, perhaps, other stories underneath Disney's umbrella since they've owned the Star Wars brand that have been as good. And I think that these games really, I think, elevate where Star Wars has really fallen behind since Disney has taken over. I don't remember when the last time there was a solid Star Wars RPG game as well. So, in terms of value, just for genre of video game, this is that right here. The universe feels expansive, the plot is engaging, Jedi feel like they're really being captured correctly. And I think on that alone, if you're a Star Wars fan, it's worth playing through these games because you're not really receiving that from the big screen or from the streaming screen with Disney at the helm. In Jedi Survivor, you play as Cal Kestis again, and it's been really fun to just see the evolution of his journey as a Padawan who's escaped Order 66 and has been in hiding ever since. But with Jedi Survivor, how it opens, in my opinion, there's a flaw right off the bat. And that is that where Jedi Fallen Order ended, everybody was together and the galaxy was kind of open to explore. And Jedi Survivor opens with the group not being together, and it feels pretty abrupt. Even if it's been a while since you've played Fallen Order, jumping into Survivor, they give you a recap at the very beginning. So I think it's jarring regardless, because right after the recap, you see Cal without the rest of the crew together. And I think that really impacts the rest of the story, because as Cal begins to seek out his companions again, the impact of the characters and the synergy I don't think feel as strongly as they did when they were organically coming together in the first game. What kind of makes that worse is that the reason for why the group is not together is kind of explained briefly in select remembrances or cutscenes. And even though you get the general understanding as to why it happened, it doesn't feel like you get the full understanding. Certainly not one that's caused by them all being together and you experiencing why they were apart. This also affects the relational payoff, I think, with characters as characters continue to develop from the first game to this game. And in some ways, I think that they were paid off pretty well. And in other ways, they felt like they fell a little bit flat. There's one particular returning character that when you come into contact with them, it just felt very weak. It didn't feel like there was a lot of weight behind it just because of the delivery and the execution of their interactions and their first meeting in this game. And that brings up, I think, another large flaw within the story of this particular game is the amount that it relies on your knowledge of the first game in terms of the characters, the personalities, the situation, because it does not really spend too much time, I think, developing characters from the ground up as if you had never played that game before. And that may seem like a no-brainer, like, okay, so you've played the first game, of course, we don't need to retread old ground. But it honestly felt very empty, and for me, it had been a while since I played Star Wars Fallen Order. So the lack of attention to detail to really set up the return of these characters felt pretty large to me. I think a valid comparison in effect is to look at the God of War and God of War Ragnarok games in comparison to these two games, Fallen Order and Survivor. God of War Ragnarok was the sequel to God of War, or God of War 4, technically. But even though all the different types of characters have really been set up in the previous game, there is still very much an attention to the story and the relationship of those characters, almost as if you had never met them before. And perhaps that reveals the intention of those games probably being really intentional on the storytelling aspect of it. But the differences between those two games and these are pretty profound when you just compare the relationships and the amount of time that you spend in understanding who the characters are, even in the sequel elements of the story. Overall, I thought that the story was exciting, but I didn't find it as exciting as Jedi Fallen Order, and the reason for that is that I felt like the stakes did not feel as high, which is kind of a weird thing because throughout Jedi Survivor, you're dealing with Imperials and Stormtroopers, and they're all over the place. But in terms of the story, that's really what I think drove the stakes in Fallen Order. The narrative itself really kind of set the scene in terms of being pursued by these different Jedi killers, and you're not getting that same sense of narrative drive in this one in particular. It feels a little bit more laid back in terms of the locations that you visit and your reasoning for being there and your objectives in these different places. And I think overall, disappointingly, it felt like the overall narrative felt like a collection of different side quests as opposed to one looming driving objective for the story. There, of course, is a driving objective for this particular game, but I feel like it's a little bit distracted by the different types of side characters that come in and out of the main story. In fact, there is one place that you're trying to get to in particular, and by the time that you get there, after hearing the name for a long time, it feels like the time spent there is relatively short, and I feel like even the payoff of that felt a little bit less impactful. Part of my disappointment, and in fact probably a larger part of my disappointment, stems from the treatment of a particular character that was teased in the trailer for Jedi Survivor. Just this mysterious character who's floating in a bacta-tank, and you're not quite sure how they're going to contribute to the overall plot. And having played through the game, I felt like this character was a little bit mismanaged. And part of it probably comes from me reading different expanded universe, Star Wars Legends now, books, and just my imagination growing wild with the possibility of what this character could be. But I feel like there was a lot of potential in the setup of this character and the delivery of this character that was just not realized. That's not to say that all new characters were not delivered well. There is a new companion to Cal's crew that is with you throughout the game that is a very interesting character. And there's also like this new species, I think, of alien that's also introduced, which I feel like Disney Star Wars has really killed it in terms of like companions being like funny and enjoyable. And this is an example of like one of those sort of side characters that really feels very fun. Unfortunately, that character doesn't play a large impact with the story. And I think even with that, there was a little bit of a missed opportunity to involve that character more with the overall plot. In terms of gameplay, there are different types of stances, is what they're called, for the lightsaber. And all of them are fairly interesting, and they have their own sort of skill tree to level up different aspects of those different abilities, like double-handed lightsaber, double-bladed lightsaber, single-bladed lightsaber, etc. So I thought that was a nice improvement in kind of giving players the freedom to change up their style and try new things based on the enemy or just based on curiosity. The overall structure of the gameplay is similar to Jedi Fallen Order, where you are a character that is continually leveling up their skills, and you'll go through different areas that are passing by things that are inaccessible, and once you've upgraded that particular skill or ability, you'll be able to backtrack and access those areas later in the game. Some people find that more annoying than enjoyable. I'm a little bit indifferent on that. I understand the necessity in the sort of gameplay loop, but to each their own. One aspect of the game that stood out to me gameplay-wise was the difficulty level. And I don't recall it being as punishing in Jedi Fallen Order as it is in Jedi Survivor. And I think one interesting tidbit is that I had not played Elden Ring at the time of Jedi Fallen Order being out. And Fallen Order had come out a few years before Elden Ring came out anyway. And I think having played through Elden Ring and really enjoying that, with the Jedi games being more of a Souls like type of game, I think it really comes down to like timing of parrying and looking for openings to slash your lightsaber, etc. And I did not find like the parrying system and the blocking system to be as punchy and as responsive as maybe Elden Ring. And so I really struggled having played through Elden Ring and being on the other side of things to really feel the same way and have that same sort of success as I had in Elden Ring. And maybe that's an unfair comparison, but I don't remember having this much of a struggle in Jedi Fallen Order. I did struggle a little bit, but I had to move the difficulty down to story mode as opposed to Padawan, Jedi Knight, Jedi Master, etc. And there were a couple of times where I was switching between the two, just trying to try them out. And even between those different modes, it is very different. Jedi Padawan and just the story level of difficulty, the story level is very scaled down. There's like a large disparity. I wish it was a little bit more even in terms of the scaling. But yeah, even in Jedi Padawan, I felt like there were some different types of encounters fighting wise that were just super punishing for no reason. And it could just come down to a matter of skill. I completely understand that. I'm not going to discount that at all. But again, having played through Elden Ring, it was very noticeable in terms of the gameplay mechanics. Another problem that I have with the game is, in my opinion, the archaic nature of the save system, which I believe is the same as it was in Fallen Order, where there are different Jedi meditation points. And when you meditate in those spots, that saves the game. So there is no real autosave feature. I think there are some points in the game where it does autosave, like if you're in a cutscene or something of that nature. But because you have to constantly be going back to these meditation points, it's a problem if the game crashes. And in my experience, the game crashed about half a dozen times. And the first time that it happened, it completely erased like 40 minutes of gameplay of me accomplishing something, so much so that when I got back in the game, I had to backtrack and do that all over again. And since then had to consciously, like over and over again, even if it was out of my way, find a meditation point, meditate there for fear that the game would crash again. So optimization wise, even after a couple years, there are still crashes that are happening that seemed like they shouldn't be happening. And the save system, honestly, I feel like there could have been a lot different ways to approach that, a lot more modern ways. One thing that I didn't think I would enjoy as much this time around was the customization and the cosmetics portion of the game. In the first game, you were basically relegated to just different color combinations of Cal's ponchos that he was wearing, as well as the color of your spaceship. But in this one, you can modify the hairstyles of Cal, including the facial hair. You can modify what he's wearing in terms of jacket, the shirt underneath that, his pants. And that stuff, honestly, I think to a lot of people seems very petty, and I don't blame them for thinking about that. I think in general, I kind of have that same feeling. But I think it becomes a little bit more important for a game that is as linear as this type of game, where it's not a true RPG, that when you add in and kind of sprinkle in these elements of customization, you kind of approach that sort of RPG feel where you can shape a little bit more of the character of who Cal is outside of his decision making and his dialogue options and all of that. So that was a very welcome upgrade to how they did things in Fallen Order. And even with the deluxe edition, I think that a lot of people, rightfully so, don't want to pay extra for what's basically cosmetic upgrades. Those cosmetic options, I think, also contributed a lot in terms of just enjoyment of having my own version of Cal and sort of how I imagine him sort of processing certain events in the game and how that has affected like his overall look. Weapon customization is also something that carried over from the past game, And while I thought that was interesting and to some degree enjoyable, the problem with that is that you don't see your weapons up close that often. So some of it seemed a bit gimmicky and not really something that was very practical to enjoy visually throughout the game. There's a cantina that you're a part of in this game as well, and your actions in the game contribute to how much it becomes populated. And with its population, there are certain vendors that you can buy different things from. And there's no like credits currency. It's different items that you find throughout the game that you can basically barter or trade for certain upgrades, essentially. And in theory, it was a good concept. I think in application, it didn't feel as impactful or as strong of just like a variation to really improve or advance the gameplay in new ways. It was a great idea, though, and I think it's a good foundation for building on in future games. With the new cantina comes this upper portion of the building that you can have a garden. And that really did not feel impactful at all. It seemed like a very unnecessary, and I'm not even going to say like a wasted feature, because wasted means that there was potential, and I don't think that there was much potential with that idea. And that really stems, I think, from the personality of one of the people in your crew from the previous game. But if you're not really cognizant to that or bought into that personality, it really is something to avoid, and it really does not do anything to the gameplay whatsoever. In terms of music, I thought that it was very serviceable. There weren't a whole lot of moments where the score stood out or the soundtrack stood out very profoundly. I think when you start to hear some of those iconic Star Wars arrangements, you know, the feelings swell, the nostalgia comes back, and the emotions are in the right place. In terms of like the locations of this game, the game starts off in Coruscant, which is great because it's a complex world. There are a lot of things going on, and there aren't a whole lot of games that really set in Coruscant, and I think really taking advantage of the infrastructure. And, you know, some people may disagree at the amount of infrastructure that was taken advantage of in Survivor, but I felt like that was a great way to at least try to set up the stakes too, being in the heart and the capital of the Empire, going through the streets of Coruscant as Cal. There was some excitement there. In terms of graphics, I thought the graphics were fine. I thought they were maybe even great. There were some portions where there were some low resolution textures, and that didn't necessarily break me out of the immersion or out of the experience, but it ran fine except for the different crashes that I experienced. But those are kind of just my overall thoughts of the game. I don't have kind of a neat way to close out these different elements except to really recap the beginning and saying that I thought this game was enjoyable, and if you're a Star Wars fan or just a fan of the first game, I think it's definitely worth playing this game. It's just with those caveats that there are certain areas that didn't land as strongly with me that I thought they were, and there's some disappointment because of that.